As the Boeing 747 soared through one of the strongest storms ever recorded over the North Atlantic, co-pilot James Wilson's shaking voice reverberated over the aircraft sound system. The woman was asleep on the jet when the captain frantically yelled, "Is there a fighter pilot on board? We have a significant medical emergency, ladies and gentlemen. I need someone with experience in combat aircraft to help me immediately because Captain Mitchell is unconscious." Kesha Washington in row 23C opened her eyes slowly. After years of missions where rest was a rare luxury, she had developed the habit of sleeping anyplace at the age of 34. However, there was something about that voice's desperation that instantly made her sit up. Richard Blackwood, a businessman, was beside his wife, adjusting his imported glasses and muttering as though anyone who qualified would be taking economy. His scornful eyes moved over Kesha, whose natural hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she was dressed simply in pants and a blouse. Rain pelted the windows with deafening power as turbulence shook the jet fiercely. There were 312 people, and panic was starting to spread. Some were already composing goodbye notes on his cell phones, others were praying out loud, and children were crying. James' voice broke over the intercom. "Please, if you have any military aviation experience, please identify yourself right once. In a Category 5 storm, we are flying blind. Additionally, I've never had to deal with this alone." Kesha froze for a time, observing the frightened expressions on everyone else's faces. She observed that no one thought she was a possibility. They saw her as simply another traveler, a black woman on her own, most likely coming from a menial job or visiting relatives. Richard Blackwood jerked to his feet. "Listen, young one. His brother-in-law works as a private pilot," he shouted towards the cockpit. "I've taken many of flights with him. I am able to assist. Sir, we need someone with specific military experience." A flight attendant hurried over. "In these situations, civilian training is insufficient. Do you have any doubts about me?" Richard puffed out his chest, her arrogance intact, even in the face of chaos. "I paid $15,000 for these first-class seats. I have more experience than anyone else on this plane." It was then that Kesha stood up quietly. Her movements were fluid, precise, unlike the desperate agitation of the other passengers. As she walked down the aisle towards the cockpit, some passengers watched her with curiosity, others with obvious skepticism. "Excuse me," she said to the flight attendant, her calm voice contrasting sharply with the chaos around her. "Colonel Kesha, Washington, Air Force, 500 hours of flight time in F-22 Raptors, demonstrating proficiency in navigation in challenging circumstances." The ensuing hush was deafening. With his mouth hanging open in shock, Richard Blackwood gazed at her in complete disbelief. "You've got to be kidding me," he said. However, there was something in Kesha's eyes that caused the flight attendant to back off. There is a complete serenity that only those who have survived far more severe calamities can truly experience. Anything that hinted at well-kept secrets and an impending display of hidden might. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying this tale of justice triumphing over adversity. You'll learn how a regular traveler transformed the most horrific flight of his life into the most spectacular example of why we should never condemn someone based just on their appearance. The Boeing 747 was still being battered by the storm when Richard Blackwood's sour chuckle reverberated throughout the cabin. "You," he said dismissively, gesturing to her. "I appreciate our military, but I won't risk my life on a delusion. This is the exact reason my wife and I spent so much money on these seats." Other travelers started chatting among themselves. In a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, an elderly woman in first class asked, "Is she truly qualified? She looks so young." The pained message was obvious. With a terrified expression on his face, James Wilson emerged at the cabin door. "Please come forward immediately if you have military experience. I've never flown alone in such a situation, and Captain Mitchell is experiencing seizures." On the final syllable, her voice broke. "Listen up, boy." Richard pushed out his chest and got back up. "I've traveled around Europe on private aircraft. I have flown in a luxury aircraft for more than 200 hours. I am familiar with every step." Kesha was silent for a while, watching the interaction. Years of military service had taught her that some fights needed to be carefully picked. However, something inside of her woke up when she noticed the young co-pilot's eyes displaying genuine sadness, and the same power that had kept her going on impossible assignments in hostile lands. "Mr. Wilson," she said coolly, "I need to know our current altitude, speed, and exact weather conditions. We're at 38,000 feet, speed 450 knots, crosswinds of 120 km/h, with gusts up to 160. Richard laughed cruelly. It's impressive that she memorized some numbers from Wikipedia. That doesn't make her a pilot. Then, without hesitation, Kesha recited emergency procedure for loss of pressurization at cruising altitude, immediate oxygen mask, emergency descent to 10,000 feet, descent angle not exceeding 15 to avoid structural stress, communication with air traffic control code 7700. She continued for another 2 minutes, detailing procedures that only highly trained military pilots would know by heart. The ensuing silence was broken only by the roar of the storm. James Wilson stared at her with a mixture of relief and admiration. "Ma'am, the cabin is his." But Richard Blackwood wasn't finished. "1 minute. Anyone can memorize procedures. I demand to see proper credentials before I entrust my life to someone who clearly does not belong in first class on an international flight." The words cut through the air like blades. Other passengers avoided eye contact, embarrassed but unwilling to confront the powerful man. Kesha felt the familiar burn of injustice, the same one she had experienced countless times during her military career, when she had to prove her competence twice as much as any man or white colleague. For a moment, memories flooded her mind. The first time she was questioned during a combat mission, when a white colonel publicly doubted her ability to lead a fighter formation. The time he was passed over for a promotion despite having the best flight record in her class. The whispered comments about racial quotas that had followed him throughout his career. But he also remembered what had made him the most decorated pilot of his generation, the ability to turn every doubt into fuel, every insult into motivation, every underestimation into a strategic advantage. "Mister, there are 3 types of pilots in this world," she finally stated, her voice full of a serenity that caused some of the passengers to shudder. "There are people who fly when it's simple, when it's difficult, and when it's not feasible." The plane plunged violently, sending several passengers screaming. And Kesha didn't even brace herself, keeping her balance with the ease of someone who had experienced turbulence far worse than atmospheric storms. "What qualifies me," she continued, "is that I am the only person on this plane that has ever flown through a war zone with 2 engines out, a destroyed navigation system, and missiles being fired at my aircraft." She took a step towards the cockpit, then stopped. "During my career, he has saved 17 aircraft in situations that the manual said were unrecoverable," she said, "and I still brought my entire squadron home." Kesha nodded and began walking toward the cockpit. But before passing Richard, she turned one last time. "Mr. Blackwood, when we reach the ground, and we will, perhaps he will reflect on how a black woman who doesn't belong in first class saved her life and that of her family." While she disappeared into the cockpit, the passengers fell silent. Some began to realize that they might have witnessed something much greater than a simple air emergency. And Richard Blackwood, for the first time in decades, felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood. The painful and inevitable feeling of being completely devastatingly wrong about someone whose worth he had underestimated, based purely on prejudices that now seemed not only cruel, but dangerously stupid. What none of us knew was that Kesha Washington carried with her not only exceptional flying skills, but also a personal history that would make every condescending word they had heard bitterly ironic. A history that, when revealed, would forever change the way everyone on that plane viewed courage, competence, and the true meaning of heroism. Inside the cockpit, Kesha Washington was faced with a situation that would have sent any commercial pilot into a full-blown panic. Captain Mitchell was convulsing violently in his seat, foam coming out of her mouth as the heart monitors blared deafening alarms. James Wilson was literally frozen in terror, her hands shaking over controls she could no longer operate. Kesha commanded, "First aid now," her voice piercing the confusion like a dagger. With the accuracy of a person who had cared for injured pilots in conflict zones, she took the captain's vital signs. As he worked, James was surprised by how efficient and accurate his movements were. "We have about 15 minutes before he goes into full cardiac arrest," she responded. 10 years flying rescue missions in hostile territory, while simultaneously adjusting the navigation instruments and keeping an eye on the captain's vital signs. "Colonel, how do you know so much about emergency medicine?" she said. In the meantime, Richard Blackwood had persuaded half of first class that they were all doomed due to a fake at the controls. When he's the only person between a wounded soldier and death, he learns a few things. He said, "Qualified people don't travel like that," to anyone who will listen. "Did you see how she was dressed? I bet she doesn't even have a valid pilot's license." His wife, Victoria, who had been silent until then, finally confronted him. "Richard, stop it. You're being ridiculous. Ridiculous." He looked at her with disdain. "I'm attempting to keep us alive. I refuse to entrust our security to someone who obviously doesn't." The sound of Kesha's voice over the intercom, now in complete control, cut off her words. "This is Colonel Washington, ladies and gentlemen. Until we arrive at our destination, I will assume control of this aeroplane. Please maintain your composure and do as the team directs." There was no mistaking the authority in her voice. It was the voice of someone used to being blindly obeyed, not someone attempting to impress or persuade. Richard was uncontrollably cold. Kesha has turned paralyzed co-pilot James Wilson into a productive aide in the cockpit. "James, please keep an eye on our pressurization and fuel systems. I need precise information every 30 seconds, but I'm going to get us out of this storm." "Yes, ma'am," James said. And for the first time since the emergency started, she felt confident again. There was something about Kesha's presence that gave her hope that they may survive this. Then she did something that left James completely confused. Kesha started mentally calculating a seemingly impossible trajectory, flying through the storm rather than attempting to avoid it. Instead of following standard emergency routes, "Colonel, with all due respect, this goes against all safety protocols," James protested. Observing the calculations, she scrawled on a notepad. For the first time since assuming leadership, Kesha grinned. She continued flying as she spoke, her hands moving over the controls with captivating fluidity. "James, let me tell you something. In 2018, I was leading a rescue mission in Afghanistan when our aircraft was hit by surface-to-air missiles. 2 engines failed, the navigation system was destroyed, and a sandstorm reduced visibility to 0. There were 17 injured soldiers who were counting on us, but the handbook instructed us to eject and abort the operation. He therefore carried out his current course of action. He trusted his experience and threw the handbook out the window. And what took place? I took them all home, all 17 of them." James realized he was in the company of someone truly extraordinary because of the weight of her comments. "James, there are instances where obeying the law results in fatalities. What distinguishes life-saving pilots from average pilots is their ability to understand the regulations well enough to breach them when necessary." The cabin door suddenly sprang open. By pretending to have the necessary experience to evaluate the issue, Richard Blackwood was able to persuade a flight attendant to allow him to board. "This is complete insanity," he said, pointing to Kesha's unusual calculations. "You're endangering all of us. I insist on speaking with air traffic control right away." Kesha didn't even give him a glance. "Tourists are not welcome in this cockpit. Mr. Blackwood, kindly take a seat." "Again, traveler," Richard's tone went up a note. "I've had more private plane rides than he has in his whole life. I am aware that what he is doing is collective suicide in the aviation industry." At that point, an intriguing event occurred. After remaining silent up until that point, Dr. Patricia Chen, the chief neurosurgery physician at Johns Hopkins Hospital, rose from first class and made her way to the cockpit. When Kesha eventually turned around, the two experts recognized each other right away. "Colonel Washington," she stated calmly. "I'm Dr. Chen, a neurosurgeon. I worked for 3 years in military hospitals treating pilots with neurological injuries. I can help with Captain Mitchell. Not directly, but as individuals who had devoted their lives to rescuing others in dire circumstances. It would be a privilege to have him here, Dr. Although the captain is currently stable, we still require close observation. Richard became increasingly frustrated as he saw this discussion. All of you are insane. This is a plot to murder us. With the patience of someone who had handled agitated relatives during medical emergencies, Dr. Chin examined him. I've handled hundreds of military pilots. Mr. Blackwood, no amount of money can purchase the training that this woman possesses. I advise you to have faith in her. Have faith. Richard gave a sour laugh. On what basis? Her own words. At that moment, Kasia took a step that fundamentally altered the course of events. Calmly, without halting her flight, she said, "Listen to military emergency frequency. James 5. Determine our location in relation to Andrews Air Force Base," she said on the radio. Colonel Washington to Andrews Base requesting identity confirmation for civil emergency. The answer was prompt. Is that actually Colonel Washington Specters? This is Military Air Traffic Controller Commander Rodriguez. We verify who he is. You vanished from view 20 minutes ago, Spectre. To find him, the entire Air Force is called into action. The cabin became utterly quiet, finally realizing that he had miscalculated one of the most decorated pilots in American military history. Richard Blackwood went pale. Andrews Air Force Base, Kasia continued, we have a simultaneous medical and weather emergency. Captain incapacitated, flying through an unforeseen storm system, requesting coordinates for emergency landing at the nearest airport with Boeing 747 capability. Spectre, he has top priority. All airspace on the East Coast has been cleared for you. We have emergency medical equipment being directed to Baltimore International Airport. Dr. Chen smiled discreetly. When he saw Richard's expression, do you know many tourists who have the entire Air Force mobilized to help them, Mr. Blackwood? But what none of them knew was that this emergency was just beginning. In the next few minutes, Kasia Washington would have to use not only her elite piloting skills, but also secret knowledge acquired during classified missions that even his military superiors did not fully know about. And when the true extent of her capabilities was revealed, Richard Blackwood would discover that he had underestimated not only an exceptional pilot, but a true living legend of American military aviation. Someone whose story would forever change his view of competence, courage, and the true meaning of heroism. Andrews Base to Spectre. We have critical information. Commander Rodriguez's voice echoed through the cockpit. The weather system is intensifying beyond all predictions. Winds of 180 km/h, hail the size of baseballs. All airports in the region are closing their runways. You are the only aircraft still in the air. The reality of the situation hit Richard Blackwood like a punch in the stomach. They weren't just another commercial flight with technical problems. They were literally flying through a meteorological apocalypse that had closed all airspace on the East Coast. James heard calmly. I'm going to need him to monitor our vertical speed. We're going to do something that has never been attempted in a Boeing 747. Her hands danced over the controls with a precision that made it seem as if the aircraft was an extension of his own body. Colonel, what exactly are we going to do? James asked, watching indicators that suggested maneuvers impossible for a commercial aircraft of that size. Controlled spiral descent through the eye of the storm, he replied, beginning to perform mental calculations that left both James and Dr. Chen impressed. A technique developed for military fighter jets never attempted in a civilian aircraft of this size. Richard felt his legs buckle. During her business career, she had met some truly exceptional people, but never anyone operating at such an advanced level of competence that it seemed to transcend normal human limitations. Spectre, another military controller's voice interrupted. This is General Patricia Hayes, Pentagon Air Operations Command. We have confirmed that it was his mission to save two other aircraft during Operation Tempest Shield in 2019. Is it true that you guided a malfunctioning C-130 through a sandstorm, using only radio communication? Affirmative. General, similar situation, different atmospheric variables. Kesha replied, as she simultaneously adjusted flight angles that made his Boeing 747 dance through air currents that should have destroyed any aircraft. James was speechless. "Colonel, you saved other planes just by giving instructions over the radio." 17 aircraft throughout her military career, she confirmed, her concentration unshaken. When he learns to see atmospheric patterns in 3 dimensions, he can guide anything that flies, even without being physically at the controls. It was at that moment that Richard Blackwood had a devastating epiphany about the true extent of his ignorance. Her, he had judged based on appearances, was not just a competent pilot. She was a living legend of military aviation, someone whose skills were studied in MEs around the world. Dr. Chen said, "Kesha, I need you to monitor Captain Mitchell. What I'm about to do in the next few minutes will subject us all to G-forces that could affect his medical condition." "Understood, Colonel. He's stable, but you're right about the G-forces." General Hayes, Kesha continued over the radio, requesting confirmation that all civilian aircraft have been directed to alternate airports. "I don't want anyone trying to follow our trajectory. Spectre, you are the only thing flying in American airspace right now. We have 13 military bases monitoring her situation. The President has been personally briefed." Richard felt the world spinning around him. The President of the United States was being informed about the flight he was traveling on, piloted by a woman he had tried to disqualify based on racial prejudice. "James, I need you to take over communications with air traffic control while I execute the descent," Kesha instructed. "I'm going to need total concentration on the next maneuvers." "Colonel Washington," Richard finally spoke, her voice broken with humiliation. I need to apologize. What I said was, Mr. Blackwood," she interrupted him without diverting her attention from the controls. "Your apologies can wait. Right now, I need to save his life and everyone else's on board." The aircraft began a spiral descent that defied all the laws of commercial aeronautical physics. Kesha had found a descending column in the center of the storm, a relatively stable air tunnel that would allow for a controlled descent below the layer of severe turbulence. "My God," James murmured, watching the instruments. "How did you know that current existed?" 10 years flying through hostile weather systems in the Middle East," she replied. "Sandstorms, man-made hurricanes created by explosions, conditions that don't exist in civilian manuals. When you survive the impossible repeatedly, the extraordinary becomes routine." "Spectre, this is Commander Rodriguez. We're seeing her trajectory on radar. This is impossible. How are you keeping an aircraft of this size stable while descending 4,000 feet per minute?" "Applied physics, Commander, and 17 years of experience turning impossible situations into safe landings." Richard watched through the window as he descended through the eye of the storm. Lightning streaked across the walls of clouds around him like apocalyptic fireworks. But the aircraft remained strangely stable, as if guided by forces beyond normal human comprehension. "General Hayes," Kesha called over the radio, requesting coordinates for Dover Air Force Base. "We'll need a runway with full emergency capability and medical personnel on standby." "Spectre Dover is ready. Main runway cleared. Emergency foam being applied. Ambulances in position. He has absolute priority over all airspace." "James, when we touch down, you'll see why they call me Spectre," said Kesha, a barely perceptible smile touching her lips for the first time since she had taken command. Over the next 15 minutes, Richard Blackwood would witness a display of technical skill and personal courage that would completely redefine his understanding of competence, leadership, and the true meaning of heroism. And when they finally touched down, he would discover that Kesha Washington was not only one of the best pilots in American military history, she was someone whose personal story of overcoming adversity would make every prejudiced word he had ever uttered a bitter and unforgettable irony. What none of the passengers yet knew was that this landing would change not only her life, but also his civil aviation policies, emergency protocols, and the way the whole world would see what a truly exceptional person can achieve when underestimated by those who confuse privilege with competence. 6 months after the miraculous landing, Kesha Washington was promoted to Brigadier General in a ceremony at the Pentagon, becoming the youngest black woman in history to achieve such a rank. Her storm navigation technique was incorporated into military training manuals worldwide, and 3 universities offered chairs in her name. General Washington saved not only 312 lives that day, the Secretary of Defense declared during the ceremony. She redefined how we evaluate competence versus appearance in our armed forces. In the audience, Dr. Patricia Chen applauded enthusiastically. She had co-authored an article with Kesha on emergency aviation medicine published in the world's most prestigious medical journal. James Wilson, now a captain, commanded his own commercial aircraft, always crediting Kesha as her greatest inspiration. Meanwhile, Richard Blackwood faced the reality of his choices. The video of his prejudiced comments during the emergency had leaked on social media, going viral with over 50 million views. Her investment firm lost 80% of its clients in 3 months, forcing him to file for personal bankruptcy. "Daddy, why do people get mad when they see your name on Google?" asked her 12-year-old daughter, innocently destroying what remained of his pride. Victoria had filed for divorce, taking half of the remaining assets and full custody of the children. "I married a man who admired success," she told the judge. Richard now worked as a salesman at a used car dealership, utilizing public transport, leading the same routine life he had earlier hated. "I found out that I had lived for 50 years with someone who confuses privilege with competence." He saw a huge billboard in the city center every morning that featured Kesha in a military uniform and read, "Leadership has no color. It has character." At an Air Force Academy lecture, a cadet asked Kesha how he handled discrimination. She said, "Let them undervalue you, young man." She invests his energy in developing capabilities he will never question, while he spends his energy questioning her abilities. A whole generation of young military people from minority backgrounds were motivated by Kesha's narrative. The whole earnings of his best-selling book, Flying Through the Storms, were donated to aviation scholarships. Richard and Kesha met at an airport 3 years later, surrounded by security personnel and assistants. She was dressed in a general's uniform. He was carrying a little cheap bag and was dressed in his blue dealership uniform. "I would like to properly apologize for what happened on that flight," he continued hesitantly. General Washington. After examining him for a while, Kesha saw that he was truly broken by his own ignorance rather than the haughty man he had previously seen. "That day, Mr. Blackwood, you gave me the best present imaginable." "In what way?" "I was reminded of my motivations by you. People like you exist to inspire me to disprove them, which makes it possible for me to save lives, train pilots, and break down barriers." Richard swallowed the lump in his throat and nodded. "His biases caused me to lose everything." "No, sir," Kesha gently corrected him. "You found that you never truly had anything to lose. Achievement is not privilege. Respect is not inherited. Appearance is not competence." Richard learned the most difficult lesson of his life when she and her colleagues left. Now, the lady he had deemed incapable of piloting an aircraft was in charge of entire squadrons. Even though he thought he was better than everyone else, he could hardly control his own life. The destruction of Richard Blackwood was not Kesha's actual form of retaliation. It sought to create a legacy so great that his pettiness was inconsequential. She discovered that the only retaliation worth pursuing is success, not just the best. "They spend time underestimating us, but we spend that time being memorable," as she stated in her most recent interview. Have you ever had someone undervalue you, only to discover later that he had made the worst mistake of his life? Tell us about your experience overcoming hardship in the comments section. For more motivational tales that demonstrate that brilliance doesn't need permission to shine, subscribe to the channel.